Well, today we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is that of evolution. And I think I like it because it's a couple of reasons. One, when you learn about it, I think you find that it's so intricate and so well put together, such a good idea when you see it, and it has so many applications. The other thing I think is that it's very misunderstood. So what we're going to talk about today is, like I said, we're going to talk about evolution, and particularly I want to start talking about this guy right here, Charles Darwin, who many of you probably know is considered the father of evolution. And so many people have heard of Darwin before. So we'll talk a little bit about Darwin and what he came up with and why. And a lot of it is, I think, like I said, misunderstood. Before we do that, talk a little bit about sort of how he got to Darwin, how Darwin began, and talk a little bit about history and people and other ideas. So going way back to people like Plato, for example, who believed in the idea that there were two worlds, and that there was some kind of God or creator or multiple gods that designed the world a particular way. But the problem was that people would see, like let's say a bird would get eaten by another bird, and the bird that ate the one bird would be like, wow, that bird is well designed and whatnot. But what about the bird that got eaten? That seems like a poor design. And so Plato's idea was that we only perceive the world through our senses imperfectly, when in fact the world is designed perfectly, which is kind of interesting if you think about the fact that our senses then would be imperfect, and it seems like we should have perfect senses. But Plato's student, so we're talking about thousands of years ago, Plato's student Aristotle came up with the idea of what he called the scala naturae, and essentially that life could be organized on a ladder, if you will, and on the rungs of each ladder you would have different species. So, for example, still once again the idea that things were created by some higher power, and that maybe you have worms down here on the lower rungs of the ladder, and then you have monkeys up here, and of course, as most people probably thought back then and still do today, humans of course are always the best or at the top. And we're going to talk about this later on, and I'm going to suggest that I bet that's not as true as you think. So we're going to talk about that. And so Plato and Aristotle, big influencers, had a large influence on how science sort of progressed from that point on for a long time. And the ideas of Plato and Aristotle and others led to a field that we called natural theology. And natural theology was the idea that you would study nature to discover the Creator's plan, and the idea essentially is that that there is a Creator or a God or whatever you'd like to call it. A friend of mine jokingly calls it the giant pickle, so it doesn't offend anybody or it offends everybody, however you look at it. And so the idea of the giant pickle, if you will, is that if you could figure out why all these things are here, that there was some hidden secret message in that. Another guy by the name of Carl Linnaeus, who was the largest influencer of a field called taxonomy, which is a science of naming and classifying organisms. Carl Linnaeus came up with this two-part naming system that we still use today, which includes a genus, which is the first part of the name, and the species. And essentially, a natural theologist himself, Carl Linnaeus came up with the idea that everything could be sort of organized and could be named. And he came up with this two-part naming system with a genus and species, and that everything fit nicely into that. Other people that also influenced Darwin's ideas later on, or were influential at the time as Darwin was coming up into the world, and things he read. One of them was this guy, Georges Cuvier, who was a French anatomist and paleontologist. So he studied fossils. So that's his big contribution. And what he would find in the fossil record is he would find fossils, say, in one area here, part of the world, but he would not find the same fossils here. And as a creationist sort of person himself, he had to come up with, well, how would I explain that? If these animals were here before, but they're not found here, what happened? And vice versa. So what he said was essentially that that there are these fossils of things that we don't see today because of this of these events that happened, and he called this idea catastrophism, which was essentially that in the past there were these big catastrophic events that wiped everything out, or wiped a bunch of things out that were in that area, and then things moved or migrated. So maybe you had a big earthquake here, everything here died, but over here was, some different sort of species, and those simply, once these died and made the fossils, these moved in to this spot. The problem is that whatever these things were, you didn't find over here, so it was hard to explain, sort of. And the other thing is, if you have, let's say you have a bird. Okay, I'll try my best to draw a bird. It's hard with this pen, and also, as you probably know already, I don't draw well anyway, but that's looking pretty good, I think. So anyway, let's say you have a bird today. You wouldn't find that same bird in the fossil record often. You would find things that look like it or related to it, but the birds you see out and about today, you often wouldn't find most of the time in fossils. So that made it a little bit difficult to explain. Two other people that are important are Charles Lyell and James Hutton, and these two guys were geologists, so they also studied sort of rocks and things like that, and fossils, and they developed an idea that they is essentially known as gradualism, and we'll mention this idea in a different context in evolution later on. But the idea of gradualism is that the Earth could change over long periods of time. So up until this point, the basic sort of thought is that the Earth is maybe a couple thousand years old, and that what happens is it's pretty much fixed. But by looking at, say, a river and looking at like the Grand Canyon and events like that, you can start to notice that the Earth can change over long periods of time. And so at that time, as people started to look at different species and how things might change over time, people started to develop ideas on how life might change itself. And the word evolution wasn't really used yet, but the idea that things could change over time did not first come from Darwin, actually. There were other people that had this idea, and one of the most famous, mainly kind of in a bad way, unfortunately, but I think we should give him credit for taking the risk of coming up with this idea, is this guy John Baptiste Lamarck, or often we call this Lamarckian theory. But it turns out his idea, as you'll see, is incorrect. But what he essentially said was, in 1809, which is interestingly the same year Darwin was born. So he published this theory in 1809 that essentially organisms could change over time based on how they used or disused certain features. So, for example, he basically said, once again, not a good drawer here, okay, is he takes something like a giraffe. There's my giraffe. And the giraffe, in its attempt to eat, tall tree leaves and stuff, it would stretch its neck out over its lifetime. And if you had two giraffes doing that, a male giraffe and a female giraffe, and they both were stretching their neck, now the idea that Lamarck had was that the next generation of giraffes would have a slightly longer neck. And so after, a bunch of generations, maybe, the kids of the grandkids sort of thing, you would have a giraffe that had this really long neck like that, or whatever. And we now know that the theory that Lamarck had, although interesting, we now know that essentially that you cannot pass on things that you gain during your lifetime. Actually, that's starting to be rethought a little bit, but for the most part, that's very much true. If you lift weights, for example, you do not pass on to your children your muscles. Children aren't born with big giant muscles because you worked out over your lifetime and built the muscle. You might you can pass on, for example, if you lifted weights and grew really abnormally large muscles, the genetic ability to do that can be passed on, but you don't pass on the muscles directly. Okay? So Charles Darwin then comes along. He's born in 1809, like I said, same year that Lamarck published his theory. He went to medical school because Charles Darwin, his family was very sort of entrenched in the medical field. His dad and his grandfather were famous physicians, and so Charles Darwin was sort of set out to be a physician, but he really did not like it, so he dropped out of medical school. Although he was doing well, he was more interested in studying nature, essentially. So he went on to basically become a natural theologist, and like many other people at the time, he was a religious person himself, although his views later changed when some events happened in his life that made him sort of rethink that. But originally he was a religious person, like most of these natural theologists were. And so after so being a well-educated person, after Darwin finished his studies of natural theology, he took this job essentially on the HMS Beagle. And this is a ship, Her Majesty's ship is what the HMS stands for, and the Beagle is the name of the ship. And his job really on the ship was not to collect new species, but rather he was there to keep sort of the captain company, because you're at sea for a long time. Most of these people are not very educated, and you kind of lose your mind if you don't have someone to talk to. And so Charles Darwin, being this educated person, was on the ship, and there were other people that were supposed to collect things. But it turned out Darwin, having this really good background in natural theology, was the one that did the best sort of collecting and finding things. And one of the things they found on their trip was on the Galapagos Islands. So what happened was the goal of the ship in the first place, this journey, was designed to sort of map the South American coastline. So they were traveling along like this, and they ended up at the Galapagos Islands. So the real point of the journey had nothing to do with really evolution or anything in the beginning. It was simply to map the coastline of this area of the world, which was not very well known. And they ended up in the Galapagos Island. And so to make the story sort of short, Charles Darwin, out at sea, collecting things, noticing things, he's reading Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology, essentially, which is like a Geology 1 book at the time. And so as he reads this, and as he travels and is collecting these things, he's starting to develop the idea that the Earth can change. And I wonder, if the Earth can change, can other things change along with it? And so he collects things throughout his journey here. And one of the things he noticed that is kind of famous now are these finches that are on the Galapagos Island, which are off the coast of South America here. And what he notices is that these finches are kind of unique. They're distinct. They look somewhat like those you find here in Ecuador and Peru and whatnot, but they're a little bit different. They're somewhat unique. And later he finds out that they are distinct, different species. And so he writes up this essay in 1844 on his ideas of evolution. Doesn't really use the word evolution at the time, but instead talks about how life can change. And if you ever read his very famous book, Origin of Species, which was actually published in 1859, although the Galapagos Islands and whatnot are mentioned, there's a whole great deal of other detail that I think a lot of people miss. And Darwin himself, actually, his sort of initial training early on had a lot to do with farming. So he raised pigeons and things like that. And we know from farming and from raising different livestock and pigeons that you can breed one type of pigeon with another type of pigeon, and you get sort of these unique looking pigeons with certain behaviors and so forth. Same thing applies to dogs. So people fail to mention this often unless they read Darwin's book, but a whole bunch of his examples have to do with things we already knew about farming and agriculture and things like that. And particularly dogs are a good example of that. All the different dog breeds we have, and people that breed dogs know that you can take one type of dog or a couple types of dogs and breed them, get larger dogs, smaller dogs, and so forth. And that is not the nature deciding there, which is what we're going to talk about in a minute. That's what we call artificial selection. And that's essentially where we decide what we want to be considered good or bad, and we select or don't select those certain traits. So anyway, in 1844, he writes up his theory, but he's afraid to publish that. He's becoming a well-known natural theologist at this point, well-known naturalist, getting a lot of respect, and he knows that this idea is not a popular idea, that life can change. So he writes this up in 1844, but he doesn't publish it. He shows a couple other people, doesn't publish it, and gets really sick, almost dies, and tells his wife, hey, if I die, send this in, because then, he's not as worried if he dies, what people think. But he recovers from that initial illness, and then in 1858, another person, Alfred Wallace, who you probably never heard of, comes up basically with the same idea. And normally what happens is when you publish a paper, whoever publishes it first is the one that gets the credit. So Alfred Wallace sends Darwin his paper for review in 1858, and Charles Lyell, who already knew about Darwin's work, presents both Alfred Wallace's work and The Origin of Species at a conference in 1859. And although both are sort of given the credit for coming up with this idea, Darwin is the name you hear about now because his idea was so well developed. Alfred Wallace kind of had an idea, but it wasn't as thought out and as well developed as Darwin, who had been working on it by then for 15 years or so. So anyway, Origin of Species comes out, and this is a picture example of his birds that he found, for example, some of them. And so see, these are some of the finches that you can find on the Galapagos Island there. And what was not known at the time, so when Darwin did his work, what was interesting was he did not know, he essentially said, look, if you take these different kinds of animals and you breed them together, like in a farming situation, you get these different features. So his idea was simply that in nature, if two things were to breed, and instead of humans deciding what traits were good, if nature decided, the idea is that you would have natural selection where certain traits, were favorable, maybe a long beak or a short beak. So that was the idea of natural selection. But what he was not able to do was tie that to anything concrete in terms of the genetic information. So at the time, Charles Darwin didn't know about how information like a beak size, how that information could be passed on. So interesting, working at the same time was this guy named Gregor Mendel, which we'll mention later on when we talk about genetics. And Gregor Mendel, at the same time, and publishing papers at the same time as Darwin, was publishing these papers showing essentially that what could happen is you could take pea plants, for example, and you could take a purple pea plant and you could take a white pea plant. You could breed them together, and in that first generation, all your pea plants would be purple. And we'll talk about this later on. And so he published papers talking about how there's genetic, he didn't use the word genetic because we didn't know about genes or DNA at this time, but he mentions that there's information in here that can be passed on, and that each organism has 2 copies of that information, and you pass that on, and the information can be hidden from one generation to the next. So this, for example, might overpower this, and so down here you get all these purple ones. But he pointed out that the information doesn't change, that white information is still in here, and you can breed that out later on. And this was something that, even though Gregor Mendel worked at the same time and published papers that Gregor Mendel published that Darwin could have used, he didn't really know about that, and we sort of put all that together much later on. So if we take Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, and what we do is we've sort of expanded that. In other words, we've taken Gregor Mendel's work and Charles Darwin's work and sort of put all that together now. That's not something Darwin did. He kept pointing out where he had trouble putting certain parts of it together. But his theory, it turns out, is correct. He just did not have certain parts of the information, which we do now. So if you take, for example, take a rabbit. I like to draw rabbits because they're pretty simple. If you draw them like that, that one's not looking so good. It could be a rabbit, or it could be a duck looking at something flying over here. You can pick whatever you like. But let's say you take a rabbit, and probably everybody knows rabbits have very high reproductive rate, meaning if you had 2 rabbits, those 2 rabbits could reproduce, and you could have very quickly a whole bunch of rabbits. And if you had 4 rabbits, you could end up with, just a ton of rabbits really quick. But in nature, out in nature, population sizes of things tend to remain kind of constant, meaning that although rabbits could reproduce and populate the world instantly almost, there's not rabbits all over the place. There are in some areas where we've removed predators, and this doesn't quite apply to humans, at least now, but for the most part, most things could reproduce more than they do, but the population remains constant, roughly. So the idea there is, if you can make a lot of babies but they don't make it, there's some kind of struggle for survival. That's the first part. The next thing is that there's variation. Okay, so one rabbit, for example, this one maybe has bigger ears. This one doesn't have an eye right now. Let's put an eye in there. So this one's bigger and this one's smaller. And you might argue, well, which one's better, the big one or the small one? And maybe both of them are okay. So there's variation. And then the next part of that is the variation is heritable, which means you can get the information from your parents, and that information can be passed on. So if you put that together, what you have is that some genes, it turns out, some of the variation is better than others, and that will be passed on, and other copies are not passed on. Okay, so some copies of the genes are passed on while others are not, and we call this idea differential reproduction. Differential reproduction. So differential reproduction, another way you can describe evolution, is that not everything gets passed on. There's a differential reproduction of certain genes. If some genes are good and give you certain traits that are good or positive or work better in an environment, you're more likely to survive and reproduce and pass those genes on. So over time, you have more and more of those genes. So the idea is not that you need something new. So a lot of people misconstrue evolution and think evolution means that you have some monkey that turns into a human. And that is a very, very limited, incorrect view, and a very more important, a very limited view of the idea of evolution. The idea of evolution, really, the concept of it is that living things can change as a group over time, and that is the beauty of Darwin's theory of evolution. So another thing people say is, oh, it's just a theory. Just a theory, so that they misconstrue also the idea of a theory. In biology, a theory is the highest level of sort of truth, if you will, that you can reach. A theory is something that has been tested in studies over and over and over again and is generally proven to be true or accurate, and then it becomes a theory. So Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection is not just an idea, it's something that has been tested over and over and over again, and it works in so many cases that, in most cases, that it is now what we call a theory. Okay? But again, it doesn't mean perhaps what you've thought before, and I hope that it sort of changes your thought on that. So talk about a couple terms you need to know now. The first term, evolution. So when we talk about evolution in here, we're talking about genetic change in a group of organisms over time. So not one individual. So you as a person, for example, you can't evolve. A bunch of people could evolve as a group. You also, another thing is people think, well, you need something new, like this person needs to grow some sort of new feature for evolution to occur, and that's not true either. You don't even need anything new. You just need a change in the genetics over time. So maybe you have, let's say you have 4 short pieces of a plant. So you got a plant that grows, and it grows in 2 forms. Let's say it grows short and it grows tall. Okay? And you have roughly a 50-50 mixture. So you have tall ones and you have short ones. If over time, and by time that can mean a lot of things, but in the case of plants, maybe it means, maybe 10 years, let's say, which is not all that long. But let's say after 10 years, you have nothing but short ones. And maybe you have 1 tall one. So your ratio is like 10-1. And if the plant height is genetic, then you can say this plant has evolved or changed over time because although you don't have anything new, you've changed the frequency or how common something is relative to what it was in the past. The idea of natural selection is that nature determines what's good or bad. And so like in the case of the livestock I was talking about, like breeding dogs, artificial selection, we go in and we say, well, I want this dog to breed with this dog. And you put 2 small dogs together or 2 big dogs together, and you get, as babies, you get what you want out of that, big dogs or small dogs. But in natural selection, nature does the deciding. So nature decides which genes are considered good or bad. Another word you need to know is the idea of a species, which I mentioned already. And this word's actually a little trickier than it might seem, but when we talk about a species, we're talking about something that can reproduce. And you need that really to some degree, because evolution, as you see here, is the idea that over generations of reproducing, that species can change over time. So we kind of need that term as well. Some other terms that are important that we'll also see later on as well. A population. A population is a group of a species. So a population is a particular thing in the same place and the same time, meaning that a population can't be from the past. The idea of a population is they interact at that particular place and time. And if you take all the genes in that population, that's what we call the gene pool. That's the sum of all the genetics you have in that area. So we can take this idea of evolution and really break it down into 2 parts. And what we're going to mainly talk about today is this idea of microevolution, which is small genetic changes in relatively small amounts of time. Later on, we'll talk about this idea, macroevolution, which deals with looking at fossils and how things might be related from a long time ago. And if you still have doubts about evolution, and you're like, well, what's the proof? Where can we see it? There are many really good examples, countless really good examples, but probably one of the best ones is this idea of antibiotic drug resistance. So here we have a particular bacteria of some sort, okay, and we have very well known cases of this. This kind of thing is pretty easy to study, actually, and you can measure this. You can measure this pretty easily. So what we have here is we have this bacteria of some sort in this hypothetical example, but we have many case studies like this. And let's say you have day 1, 2, or 3 or whatever, and you're feeling sick. So you're infected with this bacteria. So you take an antibiotic. Okay, so you take an antibiotic, and you take your antibiotic, and that is designed to kill the bacteria. So the X means that drug worked pretty well at killing the bacteria. But you'll notice that some of these lived. So there's one there, and maybe there's one there, and there's one there. Now, why did those live? Well, I don't know if that one quite, I don't know if there's 2 there or not. There's one right there dividing. Okay, the idea is that, remember, there's variation. So the chances are, if you got this infection, this might be one species of, say, E. coli or something, but within that, they're not all exactly the same. There's a little bit of variation. Some of those might be resistant to the antibiotic you're taking, okay? Just might have certain genes that make them a little bit more resistant. And what ends up happening, you kill all these off, but a few survive. And what happens normally is if you keep taking the antibiotic like you're supposed to, your immune system hopefully will kick in and it will take care of the rest. But what a lot of people do after a day or 2 or 3, they start to feel a little bit better, so they stop taking their antibiotic. And what happens is that this one and this one and this one, the ones that survive, they reproduce. And whatever genetic information they had that made them resistant to your antibiotic, they reproduce and they come back. So you'll notice you still, when you take the antibiotic, maybe the next day or a couple of days later, you still get some of them. So you killed this one, you still killed this one. But you notice you're starting to get more of them surviving now. They're passing on their genes that allowed them to resist the antibiotic. So you can very quickly, as you see here in the next one, as you pass that on, now your antibiotic's becoming kind of ineffective. And here I did like a 3-day example, but this could be 3 days or it could be a couple months. But bacteria reproduce very quickly. So actually in the laboratory, you can set up an experiment like this, which many people do that study this, and you can, over the course of 2, 3, 4, 5 days, get a nice, good example of evolution where you can measure the genetic change that has occurred in these organisms relative to what you started with. And so what we have is we have now many of these antibiotic drug-resistant strains of things, one of them being TB or tuberculosis. And what happens is patient goes in, doesn't feel good, takes an antibiotic for a few days, and then quits taking it. And then they don't feel good again and they go back. Maybe they go somewhere else. They get a different antibiotic and they take that antibiotic for a while. And what happens is over the course of many months to many years of that, you can develop these strains of a bacteria that are resistant to like most of our antibiotics, which is pretty scary. Already did that slide there, so let's just jump up, talk about some of the changes that can occur and how change can occur. One is you can have a mutation. So a mutation is any change in the DNA. So that's any mutation that occurs that gets passed on is going to sort of instantly give you evolution, if you will, because you're going to instantly have a new gene or a new change in there. I'll talk about this later on, but mutations, usually think about mutations being bad, but they can have some benefits too, or they can be neutral. So anytime you change your DNA, it's mutating, but whether it's good or bad or whatnot depends on the scenario. This is also the only source of new genetic information. So you can pass genes from one place to another. The only way you get new genetic information, though, is by mutation. You can also have gene flow where you might have one population here, one population here, and gene flow might occur between those two, bringing your information from one place to another. You can also have the case where you have events that sort of quickly change the variation you have, and then when that reproduces, whatever little variation you have sort of gets amplified. And both of these are what we call genetic drift. And there's two cases. One's a bottleneck and one's a founder effect. So the idea of a bottleneck is many, many years ago, in the 1800s, there's all these different seals. And they had a whole variety of colors of seals. And they were hunted. And most of them were wiped out. A whole bunch of them were wiped out. And what remained were just a few certain color types that probably blended in better than others. And what happened is those reproduced. And now, instead of having all the variation, now that we sort of protect those, we end up with the sort of one sort of all looking sort of the same color. Same idea could happen is instead of having this sort of be hunted, maybe for whatever reason a few of these, for example, travel off to an island. And if that island is remote enough or separate, you go over here, for example, and then those reproduce and survive, what might be on that island might be different than what you find elsewhere. The other thing that can result in genetic change in a population is the idea of non-random mating. So you probably know what random is. Random is where you just mate with anything. Non-random means there's some choice involved. And so a good example is the male peacock here. Male peacock has all these bright feathers, attracts female peacocks, and this is a good example of non-random mating because females, in this case, tend to pick the male that has the brightest colors, the biggest tail feathers, and these spots. So they've done all kinds of experiments where they've cut all that off, and they take a male that normally has, really good genes to make this, and then they cut all those tail feathers off, and then females tend to sort of avoid it. Then they've taken those tail feathers and glued them to sort of a mediocre male, and all of a sudden that male seems much more, sexy and popular. And that idea is called sexual selection. And it was something that actually bothered Darwin. This is a different idea he came up with later on, because his first idea when he was talking about natural selection, he was having trouble trying to explain why this would exist, because in nature this seems like you'd get eaten, which is true, but there's different theories to explain why this might be. But Charles Darwin said, hey, what it is the females in this case, they like that, they go for that. And so that's one. And then the main idea is that of natural selection, that nature can decide what things are good or not. And it can happen sort of in three different directions. It can be what we call stabilizing, directional, or disruptive. So in stabilizing selection, the idea is that the middle is the best. So let's say you're talking about an animal on body size. Rabbits, you could take rabbits again. So what's the best rabbit to be? Is the best rabbit the biggest rabbit? Well, maybe if you're too big, you need too much food. Maybe if you're too small, you get eaten easier. Whatever it is, in stabilizing selection, nature tends to select whatever is in the middle, and these things sort of get eaten. if you will. And the idea of directional selection, bigger would be better, for example. Or it could be the other way. So it could go either direction. It could be really small, or it could be really big. Or, again, this could be color, too. So it doesn't have to be body size. It's just the example I'm using. But let's say you're a big elephant seal, a big male elephant seal, which I've never drawn before. So it doesn't look anything like that. But they sit on the beach anyway. And males, the bigger you are, tends to be favored because they have to fight off other males. So a big male tends to be selected more than a small male. Okay? And then disruptive selection is the idea that it's better to be on the extremes. So maybe being big or being small or being really dark haired rabbit or a light-haired rabbit, but being in the middle is not good or less good. So that's what they call disruptive selection. And I'll mention one more thing here quickly. We mainly do this in majors biology. This equation you do not need to memorize, but you should be able to recognize it at least. And it's called the Hardy-Weinberg principle. And you can go onto Google if you want and find out a huge amount about if you're still a person who is having trouble believing in the math behind evolution. The Hardy-Weinberg principle is a complex mathematical formula, although it doesn't look like it here. You can see. And the idea is that this shows you how you can measure evolutionary change. So if you take, say, a P allele and a Q allele, so P maybe could be, we'll learn about this later on, could be, let's say, blue eyes, okay, just as an example. And the Q then is another allele or another set of information that maybe gives you brown eyes. And you can do this for, any trait. If you have a population and these don't change the amount of this will always be equal to the same amount it was before. But if that changes, if the frequency changes, then you can say evolution occurred. So basically what they say is there are these, several principles that have to happen for evolution to not occur. So evolution, for example, will not occur if there's random mating, for example. If mating is random, it's going to be hard for evolution to change. It's going to be hard for evolution to occur because there's going to be, so all these have to be met. There has to be random mating, okay? There has to be no natural selection. Okay, so one gene isn't favored over another. Okay, no natural selection, no mutation. So there's several, I won't mention all of them here, but essentially what they say is you can mathematically show cases of evolution occurring or not occurring based on changes of the Hardy-Weinberg principle, but all these conditions have to be met, which are almost impossible to meet, all of them. So what you find out is that most of the time living things do change. Okay, and I'll just give you a couple of examples in the real world. There's many really good examples. This guy Hugo de Vries was a botanist, and Hugo de Vries studied this plant right here called the evening primrose. And you don't see much about Hugo de Vries now because most of what he found and discovered, it turned out was sort of already discovered, and he sort of rediscovered it, but nobody knew about Mendel's work and other people's work before that. But what he found was he studied this plant, and he did a lot with the genetics of this plant, and he found in these certain cases that in a wild growing population that these plants can actually have a mistake in genetic formation where they have an unusual number of chromosomes. Okay, so they have unusual number of chromosomes. And so what would happen is these plants, probably just by mistake, would, although they were related to, they came from other evening primrose plants, their parents, when they went through to make essentially the sperm and the egg, there was a mistake made, which happens in lots of things. But in most things, when there's a mistake made, the organism doesn't make it. But it turns out in plants, mistakes are made in the genetics, and plants tolerate that very well. And the other beauty of it is plants often, most of them, have both male and female parts. So that means they have a mistake that occurs, but because they have both male and female parts, they can reproduce that. And so what Hugo de Vries found, and we found actually in many cases, is that you can take one species, and that one species can reproduce and keep reproducing and make new individuals and pass on the genetics of that. But every now and then it can make a mistake, and it might even make a mistake that crossbreeds with another that is also reproducing on its own, and then that one becomes a new species in one generation or two. Another example, back to Charles Darwin's finches. So this is years later after Charles Darwin. These two people are Peter and Rosemary Grant, two famous Grant, and they are at Princeton, I believe. And they have several graduate students, of course, studying. They've been studying finches and continuing studying Darwin's finches for many, many years. And what they do, they go out, probably they're graduate students now because they became famous, and go out and they measure everything. So you catch these birds and you measure all kinds of things. Their weight, their bill depth, how big their bill is and the size and all that. And what they found was, and they go out and they catch all these birds on this island. And what they found was what you would expect, that in their sort of original study in the 1976, there was some sort of average, and then so there were some with big beaks and some with big beaks, some with small beaks, but there was some nice average. So that is, once again, what we call stabilizing selection, which you expect a lot, is that there was some middle point that was considered really good, and being on one end was like, there weren't very many of those and there weren't very many of those. Most of them were right here. Well, there was a drought that occurred in the 1970s, and what they found only 2 years later, so it's just 2 years later, when they did this same population, they found, first of all, the blue is all the individuals. There was a huge die-off of these birds. So a whole bunch of them didn't make it. But what they found when they took the average, there was a shift, as you see here, in what the average bill size was. It actually got a little bit bigger. And what they found was when the drought occurred, many plants died, or their populations went down. The plants that tended to live had a thicker seed, and that seed was hard to open. These are seed-eating birds. So that thicker seed was hard to open, and if you had a small bill, it became hard to get those seeds. So the ones that made it were the ones that had a bigger beak and were able to open those seeds better. Okay, another example. This is by a guy who's been quite famous also, David Resnick. I might be spelling his name wrong. I think there's a Z in there somewhere. I apologize if I spelled your name wrong, David Resnick, who I've met once or twice, who is at UC Riverside. So he's one of our local famous evolutionary biologists. And what he did is he studies these guppies. And what happened in this case, in this particular study, is the guppies can be, they can essentially they can grow and be quite small and become sexually mature. And they're a tiny guppy, but they can still reproduce. Or they can be a larger guppy when they are sexually mature. And it turned out that what he found in one case was that these predatory fish, okay, so here's one predator, here's another. This predator eats small guppies. This predator eats large guppies. So if you're a guppy and you're a large guppy, you get eaten. So small guppies are better in these ponds, and what happens is they tend to genetically favor small guppies and they reproduce, and if you're a large guppy you get eaten and you're gone. And that's the opposite up here. So what he did was, because this is I believe in Trinidad where he did this study, so they can weigh these guppies and measure them and take measurements of their genetics and all that. So what he did was he goes, okay, up here we have guppies, and we have this particular predator, but there were no guppies in this particular pond. So we take the guppies from here, which are usually eaten by this predator, and he said, what if I go catch these guppies and I move them in here where there's this predator? And what happened is, over time, evolution changed the selection force on these guppies so that they ended up being, instead of like this guppy here being small, they tended to be a larger guppy. And that's what you can see. And this is an 11-year study in this particular case. So it's another good example of the many that are out there about how things can change genetically over time, and so how evolution can occur in something, and how you can study it, and how it is not just a theory, as we say. It is just a theory, but that word is good. That means that is sort of the highest level of acceptance. Really, in biology, if you've reached the theory level, it's like, that's generally pretty much true. In fact, they find cases where it's not true to be interesting because it's so rare that it doesn't work like that. Okay.